welcome to Piper Pods. Today we're going to be focusing on the central nervous system. So unlike the peripheral nervous system, it involves the brain and the spinal cord itself. Okay, so that's all the central nervous system is made up of, but as you'll see, it is an incredibly complex system. Today's lesson will be focusing mostly on the brain itself and the way it communicates and the way it sort of works with the rest of the body. And I'll try to keep it as simple as possible, whilst alluding to the fact that it is far more complex than I'm actually giving it credit for. Okay, so we'll start off and we'll start looking at the human brain itself. Now, as mentioned, it's an incredibly complex system. If you were to try to map everything that the brain does, even in an hour, it would take you the better part of 2 years to catalogue everything that happens in the brain. It's quite small as far as percentage of body weight goes, but over the generations, like in the last 100,000 years, our brain mass has actually tripled in size. And the way that sort of works is we've always had our inner brain, so our smaller brain, our cerebellum, that's always been pretty much the same, but our cortex, especially our prefrontal cortex, has tripled in size, and especially in surface area. So a lot of it has actually grown out and over the midbrain and the actual internal structures themselves. So 100,000 years ago, it was much like a reptilian brain, where it's small prefrontal cortex and the midbrain and the hindbrain were essentially exposed. Over the years, it's grown over the top and has engulfed that. So we'll talk a little bit more about the inner structures from there. I just thought it was interesting on an evolutionary side of the house that our brain has increased in surface area and mass over the last 100,000 years. Now, our brain needs to be looked after. It gets taken care of first. So 20% of oxygen and 15% of all of our cardiac output goes straight to the brain. Okay, and it's used by the brain first. It's what gets fed. And 10% of all energy produced in the body is utilized by the brain. Okay, so despite being only 2% of our body weight, you can see it takes up a good chunk of our nutrients and energy sources. So because it is so precious to us, we need to sort of understand how the body protects the brain and what sort of things are available to the body in order to keep it safe. Now, the skull and the vertebrae may be kind of obvious that they protect it. You have a hard outer layer that protects it from absorption, vibrations, but also temperature as well. So the skull plays a massive role in that, as does the vertebrae. They take care of the spinal cord within it. But from there, we have three other specialized areas of protection. They're the meninges, cerebral spinal fluid, and a concept known as the BloodBrain Barrier that we'll go through in more detail with each of those. So the meninges are made up of three layers with all different structures that protect the brain itself. So just underneath the skull, we start with the dura mater. So the very first layer of the dura mater lines the inner lining of the skull. And then we have a space, a subdural or an epidural space, and then we have this second layer of the dura mater. Now, unlike other areas in the body that need two layers, obviously like the pleural space in your lungs, your actual heart involves in a lot of movement, the dura two spaces aren't there for movement. They're there in order to create sinuses, and sinus cavities in which can hold our cerebral spinal fluid, to aid in the reabsorption and filtration, eventually, of that cerebral spinal fluid itself. So that's why we have the two layers, is so we can have that space, and then in certain areas, especially around the fistulas, we can have a sinus cavity in which the fluid can pool itself. Okay, so that's the dura mater. When you look at it, it looks like a thick, leathery outer layer, and it goes through completely around the brain and then also down the spine itself. Now, just underneath the dura mater, we have the arachnoid space. Now, this is a highly specialized structure. There's a field of collagen fibers. So a huge amount of collagen fibers are present in the arachnoid space, and it makes it look a little bit like a spider web when you look at it. Now, the arachnoid space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, that's where the cushioning, that's where the nutrient aspect of the cerebral spinal fluid is utilized the most, is within the arachnoid space. And we'll talk a little bit more about cerebral spinal fluid, but just so you know, that's where it goes. Now, there's specialized structures around the fistulas of the brain that are called arachnid ganglination areas. Now, they're highly permeable structures that allow cerebral spinal fluid to leak into the dura mater sinuses. The third layer of the meninges is called the pia mater. Now, the pia mater is a semi-permeable membrane and is the only membrane that touches the brain itself. Okay, so if you were to break a brain up and have a look at it, you don't be able to see it under a microscope. But what the pia mater allows us to do is have capillaries integrate with the brain itself whilst maintaining that blood-brain barrier. Looking internally, talking of cerebral spinal fluid, we're just going to talk a little bit about the ventricles itself. So inside the actual brain, we have a series of ventricles. Now, it's just broken up into 4 different ventricles. Okay, now the left and right, they're not often called 1 and 2, but so the 2 big wings on the outside are 2 ventricles, and you'll see them on CTs and things like that. The third ventricle is right in the middle of the septum, and the third ventricle is further to the base of the actual brain stem. Now, what the ventricles are there for is to hold and house that cerebral spinal fluid, as well as some specialized structures that we'll talk about later on. But this allows cerebral spinal fluid to fill the space. What gives the brain a lot of its intracranial pressure is these ventricles. And from the ventricles, it allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow into that arachnoid space and then finally into the subdural sinuses themselves. Okay, so that's what the ventricles look like and what they do. When we start looking at cerebral spinal fluid and where it comes from, we know that cerebral spinal fluid is there for nutrient space, and we know that it's there for a protective cushioning side of the house. So it has a great absorption rate. Now, as far as fluid goes, it's a transparent fluid that is very similar to plasma. Okay, it has slight differences as it doesn't have the same proteins that plasma has. Its iron concentration is less, but its glucose concentration is higher. So the site of production for this cerebral spinal fluid is an area right in the middle of the brain called the choroidal plexus. Okay, and this is where cerebral spinal fluid is made. Now, at that area, it has slightly more permeable capillary filtration, but still highly specialized. So it doesn't allow certain proteins, it doesn't allow iron to come into the brain, but it does allow your fluid, your glucose, to come in order to make this cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, from there it travels down into the fills the ventricles. When it gets to the 4th ventricle, the one down the base of the spine, midbrain itself, then it can leak out into that arachnoid space and fill the volume surrounding it. Okay, from there it also goes down into the spine, so it covers the actual arachnoid space surrounding your spinal cord as well. Okay, so it just keeps circulating around based on pressure. Now, cerebral spinal fluid will keep being produced, okay, because when it gets to the arachnid granulation area, it moves into the subdural sinuses where it's reabsorbed into the vascular system itself. Okay, so at any one time, there's about 150 mils of cerebral spinal fluid, but about 500 to 550 mils of cerebral spinal fluid is produced each day. So, quick calculation, you can see that cerebral spinal fluid replaces itself about 4 times a day. Okay, and that aids in filtration, it aids in new nutrients coming in and waste removal as well. Okay, we can mention it now that the brain itself doesn't have a lymphatic system, and this plays a bigger role when we start talking about the blood-brain barrier. So it's the replacement of the cerebral spinal fluid is the only way for the brain to remove any form of waste products from there, okay, apart from the obvious gases exchange. Okay, so that's what the cerebral spinal fluid can do. Okay, our last area of protection that looks after our brain, because it's highly specialised and very, very susceptible to chemical changes, okay, how it works, is we need to be able to protect it from toxins, from substances that does the brain harm, but then also allow certain specialised nutrients to come into the brain in order to be utilised. Okay, and this whole system is known as the blood-brain barrier. So it's a physical barrier that stops harmful substances coming into most areas of the brain, but then it also allows for specialised selective active transport of nutrients to feed the brain. Okay, so that's what the blood-brain barrier does. When you look at the blood-brain barrier and the difference, the only difference is the endothelial cells are more tightly packed together. So it doesn't allow for water to leak out in between the endothelial cells, much like so in normal vessels, that's what happens. The water will just leak out, and with the water you can get generally nutrients to leak out as well as toxins and drugs, and the bioavailability of drugs is much higher in general organs compared to the brain. The brain itself has enclosed capillaries, okay, and it also has a very limited amount of exocytosis and endocytosis function as well, so moving of substances in and out. Now, the thing that the blood-brain barrier is useless for is your gases. Okay, so your gases can definitely transport in and out, no problems at all. It also has specialised channels that allows glucose to come in. It pretty much stops potassium coming in, but it allows your sodium levels to go in as well. Okay, so it is basically a highly specialised substance. Now, there are certain substances that are completely free to move through the blood-brain barrier, and that is anything that is lipid soluble. Okay, so ethanol is a classic one. You're drinking ethanol can pass through pretty much any cellular membrane, including the brain. That's why the associated effects of intoxication is found on the brain. Okay, so that's what the blood-brain barrier is useless towards, is anything that is lipid-based, soluble, can just pass straight through it. Now, certain areas of the brain allow a few more substances to come in, and that's associated with your chemoreceptors within your brain that has to register certain levels of toxicity in order to allow an action to occur. So within those areas, the capillaries are slightly more permeable, allowing the toxin registry to be picked up in order for messages to be sent to do something about. But most of the brain is a closed circuit. Okay, so closed circuit to most filtration. Okay, it is not susceptible to hydrostatic pressure because it's all closed off. It's not as susceptible to your osmotic pressures either. The main way that the brain swells is the stopping of that movement within the cerebral spinal fluids itself. Okay, so if something stops the cerebral spinal fluid getting absorbed, that's when we start getting swelling of the brain, hydrocephalus. Okay, it's got not as much to do with the actual edema or anything like that. Okay, in order to get that, you need specialised soluble substances that can move through the blood-brain barrier or destruction. So the main thing that causes pressure on the brain is obviously your blood, okay, and your hemorrhages, hematomas, things like that. Okay, just a quick note on the spinal cord. We don't need to talk about it too much because we spent a lot of time in the peripheral nervous system discussing it, but just so everyone's aware that most of the protective ability from the brain extends down through the spinal cord itself. So the spinal cord has similar structures to the brain. Okay, it's made up of the same substances along the spinal cord, and it's also protected by those meninges. It's fed and protected by the cerebral spinal fluid itself. The spinal cord sac extends a little bit further than the actual vessels do. So the whole dura and arachnoid will travel all the way down to the spine until it gets to your cornus medalis, and then you'll have a nice sac area around the L4, L5 region that doesn't have any spines within it. Okay, and that's just essentially to hold cerebral spinal fluid to feed back up to the brain. So from that point on, the nerve endings will branch out in their tails in order to supply the lower limbs. Okay, and that's the spinal cord, it's the central nervous system of the spinal cord looks like and how it's protected. From your spinal nerves themselves, what you'll find that is within the central nervous system, you'll have your initial dendritic cell body in the spinal cord, and then the axons will move out from there. Now obviously it can be a series of neurons like we spoke about with the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic, or it can be a continuous axon like we spoke about with the motor neurons themselves. Okay, but all the dendritic cellular bodies will start in the central nervous system and be found within the actual spine substances themselves. Okay, so that's where they start, and then they branch out into the peripheral nervous system from there. Okay, so that's what protects the brain. Now to break the brain up into its different parts and how it all works together. So there's 4 main parts of the brain that we can break it up to. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebrum obviously is the largest part. Diencephalon could be known as your interbrain. The brain stem is specialized structures that connects to your spine, and then your cerebellum is your little brain, if you will, that sits at the back. But we'll give you a little bit more detail than that as we go along. So we'll start right up with the cerebrum itself. Okay, largest part of the brain, and this is where everything to do with you is taken care of. So all of your personality, your learning, your sensory, your motor cortex, everything is found within the cerebrum itself. Okay, so you'll find that it takes care of a lot of roles. It has 2 hemispheres, and they're connected by specialized fibers called the corpus callosum. Okay, now each hemisphere controls the other side of the body. Okay, and I know you all know that. We'll talk about the structures that aid in that. But the right hemisphere sends messages and receives messages from the left side of the body. Okay, that's how it works. Now, from the actual main part of the cerebrum itself, it's broken up into 5 different lobes, and we'll talk about each one of them in detail. So we have the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and the insular lobe found in the cerebellum. What aids in us being able to retain a lot of information and increase our surface area of brain tissue within a limited space of our skull itself is specialized folds and crevices within the actual cerebrum itself. If it wasn't for the surface area, our brain would have to be twice the size, and therefore our heads would need to be twice the size in order to have the same material that is found within the brain. But because of the specialized structure, that it has a very large surface area to volume ratio, it allows for more information and more brain tissue to be stored in a smaller area. Now the peaks, if you will, of the brain are known as gyrus or gyri. Okay, so they're the large folds of the brain, and they're the peaks that you'll find. When you get the crevices within it, the crevices are known as a sulci, okay, or a sulcus itself. Okay? And when you have a division of an area generally happening around the lobes themselves, we turn those sulcus into a fistula, okay, or a fissure itself. There's a lot of options basically, but the fissures essentially are the best way to define where the different lobes finish off. Okay, so the central sulcus, or the central fissures, because it's a deep sulcus, it divides the frontal and the parietal lobe. Okay, and then we have the parieto-occipital fissure, and then we also have our lateral fissure as well. Okay, so they're just main folds within the body, and they aid in the division within it. Now, it's very easy when you start looking at the brain to get confused that they're, for lack of a better term, without giving too much away, a mirror image of one another. Okay, so the cerebral cortex itself and the cerebrum as a whole is made up of 2 hemispheres. So it's what you have on the left as far as lobes go, you have the identical on the right as well. And that's how our surface area can increase. From there, we need to look at specialized material. Now, we've all heard the terms grey matter and white matter, but it is that way because of differences in the cellular formation and differences in structure. So grey matter is grey because they're unmyelinated neurons. So there's no myelin surrounding the neurons of the grey matter itself. So the grey matter is found in an area known as the cerebral cortex, and there's also specialised grey matter deep within the white matter called the basal nuclei. Now, the advantage of having unmyelinated neurons in the outer cortex and the basal nuclei is it allows those particular neurons to be something known as multipolar. Now, multipolar means that they're not governed to follow a particular route, and it is very easy to have interneuron connections between unmyelinated areas, and you can have junctions pretty much the whole way along. You don't have to wait until you get to the end where you'll find the pre-axon terminal. It can form right in the sides. Messages can be passed on all the way along the neuron itself. Now what that allows, it allows your cerebral cortex and your basal nuclei to learn, for lack of a better term. So new pathways are able to be developed because of the unmyelinated neurons found in those areas. So the cerebral cortex is responsible for everything we do and everything we sense. Okay, now obviously we'll talk about a few specialized structures within, but realistically, cerebral cortex is what gives us all of our memory, all of our personality, our language centers, the works. It's all done in the grey matter of the cerebral cortex. Now, as we learn a new skill, as you start learning about the central nervous system, for example, you'll be starting to make connections within the grey matter of your cerebral cortex. From there, those connections will stay fixed and strong if we keep using that material. So if from this lecture you go on and you continue reading about the central nervous system and you just keep going and learning, then the connections that are made in the grey matter will stay, they'll improve, they'll optimize, and then all of a sudden it will be long-term memory, and then it'll be fixed. As soon as we stop using that area, as soon as you learn about central nervous system now, don't touch it for another 10 years, and those connections will be dropped. So it'll only maintain the connections as long as they're being utilized. Okay, so the key to memory, and the key to long-term memory, is assimilation. If you can draw assimilations between subjects that you are learning, then you will have multiple pathways all connecting to the same point. Therefore, if any particular stimulus comes along, you'll have a connection to everything related to it. And that is all done by the grey matter itself. Now, the same is true with the basal nuclei. Okay, the basal nuclei is similar to the cerebral cortex, but it's involved in fine-tuning movement, which we'll talk about. The other area you'll find in the cerebrum is known as white matter, and this is myelinated neurons. So what they do is they pass messages from different parts of the brain to other areas of the brain. Okay, that's what white matter does. So it's not involved in learning, creating any links to anything, it is just passing message on. Okay, it does that by specialized fibers. Okay, so your commissary fibers, okay, the most common one is the corpus callosum. That's the one that passes information from between the two hemispheres. Now, associated fibers is connecting fibers that will pass information within the same hemisphere. So if two different areas of the brain need to work on the same thing, and it's associated fibers that will pass that message on. And that happens a lot when we're dealing with the brain itself. You'll find that there's a lot of overlap with skills, especially language skills, that need to be passed on, and that is all done by associated fibers. Now, the projection fibers are nice and easy ones. They're the ones that pass the information from the lower brain to the cerebrum, or the spine itself to the cerebrum. Okay, and they're projection fibers, but that's what white matter does. Okay, so that's the difference when people say white matter and grey matter. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so just a quick look. We won't go into too much detail with the cerebral cortex now, but just to let you know where everything lies. So I know most people would be familiar with the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe, but the insular lobe often gets missed when you're dealing with basic anatomy physiology, because it's found behind the frontal and behind the temporal itself. Okay, there's a little bit of the parietal in there too, but if you pull them back, then you'll see the actual insular level itself. Okay, there's two specialized areas that I want to draw your attention to as well, and that's your Broca area in the frontal lobe and your Wernicke's area back in your parietal lobe itself. Okay, so those two areas we'll talk a little bit more about. The other area that we'll focus a lot on is if we look at that central sulcus, okay, or the central fissure, you'll see on the precentral gyrus, all right, you'll see a specialized structure called the primary motor cortex. And then on the postcentral gyrus, you'll see a primary somatosensory cortex as well. So there's two other very important areas that we'll talk about in more detail as we go along. So that's what it looks like as a whole. Now we'll break down each of the lobes quickly and discuss its own specialized functions from there. Okay, so starting right at the front is the massive frontal lobe. So it's the biggest lobe you'll have, and it goes across both sides of the cerebral hemisphere. Its main responsibilities is with your primary motor cortex and your premotor cortex. So primary motor cortex is what sends messages to your body to conduct movement. Now your premotor cortex is there in order to maintain the memory of long-term movements. So let's say you're playing a game of basketball and someone passes you the ball. Your primary motor cortex will work on the messages to catch the ball. Whilst that's happening, your premotor cortex is already stacking up moves that you've analysed to dribble the ball, dodge a player, shoot it at the basket. All that next moves, if you will, are being loaded up in the premotor cortex to be passed on to the primary motor cortex as you're going along. Okay, so that's what those two do together. You have a specialized area within the frontal lobe called the Broca's area, and that is a isolated area that works purely on the muscle formation for language. Okay, so obviously you can imagine the intricacy that is needed with muscle movement when you are communicating. So we have an area of the brain called the Broca's area that takes care of that. That's why you can have what's known as a Broca's stroke. It means a person thinks they're saying the right thing, but nothing intelligent is coming out. Now on top of that, besides just movement, the frontal lobe is also responsible for you. Okay, your insight, your philosophy, your personality, abstract thinking, memory, you. This is the area of your brain that is the last to form its links. So when you're young and you're a teenager, you've got a very different personality, you don't have as much insight into the world, your judgment may be questionable. It's because your frontal lobe isn't fully developed and won't be fully developed until the age of about 25. So sorry for anyone out there that's a little bit younger, you'll get there. And that's what your frontal lobe does. So a very important lobe as far as they all go. Okay, from there we move back, we're past that central sulcus, and we're into the parietal lobe. So again, both sides of the body, okay, two parietal lobes, and this is where your somatosensory cortex. So this is the area that receives the messages eventually from your sensory side of the house. Okay, this one's also very important in perception, comprehension of language, and your spatial orientation. Okay, now it also has strong associated fibers linking this area to your visual areas to that somatic sensory information together. So as you're looking at something and feeling it, the information is getting processed together. Okay, temporal lobes, right at the side of your actual brains themselves, they're highly involved in working with auditory information. Okay, auditory information. They also receive information from the occipital region for analysing, if you will, or helping to analyse visual information. Now, it also plays a strong role in memories. So memories associated mostly with auditory. So you ever wondered why you can remember a song for so long? Is because the temporal lobe has its own special complex memory side of the house. That's how we can memorize the spoken language. It's why we memorize songs, is because our temporal lobe takes care of that side of the house. Okay, it also has a specialized area within it called the Wernicke's area. Now the Wernicke's area is temporal and parietal. It sort of goes over both. Okay, I know before I said parietal, so don't get beat around the bush. It essentially overlaps in both areas, hence why the parietal temporal area is associated with language, because that's what the Wernicke's areas will actually do. Okay, so Wernicke's will help you in understanding the written and the spoken language. Okay, that's what it does. Now we have a lot of specialized machinery now, like PET scans, and what they've actually found and what they're starting to research in now is they're actually finding a closer link in the Wernicke's area being utilised the most when we're trying to sound out words that we don't really know. So when I was saying Wernicke's or Wernicke's, I was trying to sound it out to try to get a little bit of an information in there. It was actually that area that was giving me the most assistance in sounding out these words. Okay, so just a little bit of tidbit. So I'm just going to pretend that I was saying it wrong for starters, so then I can illustrate this point. Nice and done. You all believe that. Beautiful. Okay, from there, occipital. So we all know the occipital region is associated with visual. Okay, so primary visual area, but it's also got a little bit of that analysis of the visual area as well. So it's like visual versus perception. That's all done in the occipital region, and then taps in with the temporal lobe in order to understand things like the written language. Okay. Now this is also the main region where the corpus callosum swaps over to the between the hemispheres itself. Okay, so that's the occipital region. When we look at the insular region, area that we haven't really looked at before, this is everything to do with your gustatory cortex. So everything to do with the assimilation of smell and taste and working memory and analysis of what you're smelling and what you're eating is all done within that insular lobe itself. Okay, so quite an important one. If you smell something and it reminds you of mum's cooking, brings on an emotional response, it's because of those associated fibers between the insular and the frontal lobe itself, bringing on that emotional response as a base of eating or smelling something. Okay, so that's your outer cortex itself, and there's your lobes and what they do in the brain. From there, we'll go a little bit deeper and we'll link this one together. So this isn't part of the cerebral cortex itself. This is a standalone. Okay, you could probably call it part of the midbrain itself. Okay, and this is the basal nuclei. Now, as I mentioned before, it's involved in movement. So you'll find that there's a lot of things involved in movement. Now, the basal nuclei works very, very, very closely with the cerebellum itself, which we'll learn about later. Okay, so this is the area that allows people to do complex movement and mostly memorize concept movement. This is where the concept of muscle memory comes from. So if you're learning a dance move and all that interpretation is happening in the outer cortex, okay, so the cerebral cortex does all the initial moves as you're learning, then as it comes down you start to get more complex. It's your basal ganglia that will come in and it will help in that complex routine. And on top of that, it will give you the dopamine stimulus of pleasure, a reward for completing those complex moves as well. So a lot of the time that sense of accomplishment, the sense of reward from completing something that you've been working on a long time, whether it's skateboarding, sport, or whatever it is, physical, okay, maybe even learning how to knit, who knows what it is, but that rewards pleasure sensation is coming from the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei itself as well. Now it has projection fibers through the thalamus into the basal ganglion. The thalamus works as a gateway. Okay, so it allows for your basal ganglion reward centers to be passed on to the rest of the pleasure centers within the body, including your limbic system itself, which is essentially around the same area. Your limbic system is made up of mostly the same things that you see here. It's associated with your hippocampus and your amygdala as well. So your hippocampus is a lot of where that memory pleasure centers come from. Okay, why we continue to do things because of a pleasure relay. And your amygdala, it is based to emotions, but most of the time it's associated with that fight or flight response. So it's the internal reptilian brain that takes over, removes all logic, and allows you just to kill something that's threatening you. Okay, so it does that, but it's also associated with other emotions. Now, this whole region that we're looking at and talking about is controlled by dopamine. Okay, and it's the lack of dopamine in these areas that it brings on the inability to allow for complex movements, and that's where you get your Parkinson's, that sort of thing. Parkinson's disease is associated purely with this basal ganglion area. Okay, so on top of all of this stuff, it also helps analyze all the things, all the background noise as well. So when we're walking along, our premotor cortex and our actual motor cortex is taking care of the physical movement, but it's our basal ganglion that is allowing our hands to move and our heads to bob in order to protect and works with those proprioception fibers. So if there's a problem with that, complex complete movements sort of blow out the way. Okay? Now we will learn that there is a close associated fiber link between the basal nuclei and the cerebellum itself as well. Okay, from there we're going to move on to the interbrain. So the diencephalon itself, known as the interbrain, it's broken up into three main areas. We have the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Thalamus, as I've already said, is your sensory filter. It controls your mood and it helps coordinate body movement with the basal ganglia. Okay, so that's what it does. Hypothalamus we looked at in the endocrine system. That's your powerhouse, your absolute control center. It controls the link between the neuro with the endocrine, helps with emotional state, and produces its own hormones and stimulates a lot of other hormones being produced. Now, the epithalamus is a region where the carotid plexus is found, so the production of cerebral spinal fluid, but it's also where your pineal gland is found, so therefore it's associated with melatonin and its link with the limbic system and arousal, eating, drinking, that sort of thing. That's all taken care of by the epithalamus, and all this sits in an area of the brain called the diencephalon. So think of it as internal brain receives the messages first from the body and then helps filter it out to the associated areas from there. So there's a lot of projection fibers that go through the diencephalon, and it's the diencephalon that helps relay the information to the right areas of the body. Looking at the brain stem, I've got this picture in here so that we can see the different colours, because when you look at it any other way, it just looks like an extension of the spine. So we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. They're the main areas of the brain stem. Now, not surprisingly, you can understand that a lot of the functions to do with the brain stem is in projection fibers. So passing information from the body to the brain. Okay, that's the main job, but we'll look at the additional jobs that the brain stem takes care of as well. So, starting with the midbrain. So the mesencephalon, midbrain, sits there and it's the link. Okay, like most of the areas, it's a link between certain areas. Okay, so the substation nigra is its link between the body and the basal nuclei, and it also branches off to the cerebellum as well from there, just a little bit. Okay, but most of the time, it has these four protrusions, four little nodules sitting on it called your corpus quadridiums, and there are the reflex centers of your vision and your hearing. So they take care of all the little things that we don't often think about to do with vision and to do with hearing. Now, a lot of these things obviously are taken care of by specialized sensors within the brain, but the secondary information that we need is taken care of by the midbrain. So if someone throws a projectile and you find yourself watching it in order to analyze its flight, where it's going to land, what sort of damage it's going to do, it's actually this reflex center within the corpus callosum that is taking care of that. Also, when you're trying to hear something and you all of a sudden turn your head, tilt your head down, put your ear towards it, start focusing your brain on that actual sound itself, again, it's this region that has helped coordinating all that side of the house. Okay. Now, your pons, we all hear about, is very important when controlling your breathing centers, but it's also vital in the relaying information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So it's got a lot to do with passing on the information with movement. Okay, so mostly the pons is made up of a whole bunch of fiber tracts, but it does have specialized link to breathing centers and the link between the cerebrum, the actual higher function, to your lower function itself. Okay, now, as you can see, there's a lot of involuntary coordination that is taken care of by the midbrain, okay, or the brain stem itself. Now, this is actually the exact reason why someone can be in a coma but still have vital functions. So imagine if someone's in a coma because the outer cerebral cortex is damaged, therefore all your higher functioning conscious activity is taken care of by your cerebral cortex. But your involuntary, life-stabilizing side of the house is taken care of by your interbrain and your brainstem itself. That's why comas, stable comas, are possible in people. And that's why we can also knock people out with certain drugs without really interfering too much with the rest of their vital functions as well. Moving down, we have the medulla oblongata. Now this is, again, the main merging point with the spinal cord, so a lot of projection fibers. This is the area that contains that structure I was talking about before. So the geissation of pyramids is actually the area where the right hemisphere fibers cross over to the left side of the body and vice versa. It happens at the medulla oblongata. Okay? Now, as we know, this is where also all your vital visceral activity is regulated from, is your medulla oblongata itself. Okay, so your blood pressure, heart rate, perfusion stat, all that stuff is taken care of by the medulla oblongata. On top of that, surrounding the entire brainstem, we have the reticular formation. Now this is specialized grey matter that allows for multiple multipolar information to be passed on to all your visceral organs. So all the visceral organs, all your smooth muscle contractions, everything like that is coordinated through this reticular formation. Okay, it also plays a role in maintaining and turning off consciousness. So if the body needs to, it can stop all information going to the higher function cerebral cortex in order to maintain survival. That is done by your reticular activation system. Okay, that's what the brainstem would do. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have the cerebellum. So this is the second largest, okay, and a lot of reports say it actually has just as many neurons passing through it as the cerebrum itself. Okay, so that's pretty good. So it's a highly dense, packed area that has two hemispheres itself, okay, and it's responsible for your analysis of proprioceptive information. So it's all got to do with your equilibrium, your balance, and your fine-tuned muscle stabilization throughout all movements. Okay, so that is all taken care of by your cerebellum. So when you get intoxicated and you start to stagger around, you lose your equilibrium as well as your dexterity, your cerebellum gets hit as well as your premotor cortex getting hit as well. Okay, so that's what your cerebellum does. It's your mini brain, takes care of balance and equilibrium. Last thing we need to speak about is something known as somatotopic maps. Okay, so this is areas of the body that we spoke about, so that motor cortex and that somatosensory cortex, either side of the central fissure. Okay, these are specialized areas within the body that are responsible for the sensory and the motor aspects of each part of the body. Now, the cool thing about these particular areas is the segments are not equally distributed. So if we look at the motor cortex, any area of the body that it requires fine motor control has more neural activity at the site, therefore more areas in the brain to take care of it. Same too with the sensory, those areas that are more sensitive in the body, okay, has more of those sensory receptors, is obviously going to require a larger segment of the brain to take care of it. Now this concept is known as somatotopic mapping. So if we think about percentage of brain, and if you were to make a human based on that, so what your brain attributes most brain matter to, then it gets something known as a homunculus, which is what is made. So here we have two different homunculuses, and this essentially represents the body parts that are attributed greater percentage within the brain. So the sensory side of the house has slightly larger lips, okay? So lips, tongues, hands have the most sensory aspects to it, as well as your ears, things like that. Okay, so large ears, that sort of thing. Now sensory compared to the motor, we also have things like your internal organs. You can't move those, but you can sense them, and also your genitals. So the sensory homunculus will have genitals, whereas the motor homunculus will not. Okay, sensory homunculus has ears, motor does not. The motor homunculus has enormous hands because the dexterity and the actual information, motor information that's required to move the hand is immense, absolutely immense compared to your arm. So that's why in these homunculus, we have different percentages. So this, if your brain was to be asked a question, what do you look like? This is probably what they'd come up with. Okay, so it's just a matter of interest to know that any parts of the body that require more sensitivity, so more receptors or more fine motor control, will be attributed a larger segment of the cerebral cortex in order to function. Okay, so that is the central nervous system. I hope you got something out of it. A lot of the time, as far as clinical goes, it just helps our understanding of bioavailability drugs that can go to the brain. Conditions like Parkinson's, TIAs, CVAs, ataxia, all those sort of diseases or pathological states of the brain that you can get, you can sort of have a better appreciation of what's happening in the brain and why you will probably get those associated signs and symptoms. But we'll finish it off there. So until next time, take care.